Hi, I'm Kevin and I collect old irons. My favorite category among the old irons is the fluters. I have about 120 some odd fluters altogether, and we have looked at some portion of that collection in 3 videos. Those videos dedicated to the hand fluters, the machine fluters, the combination fluters, but I have a diversity of other fluters as well. So for this video we are going to do an overview of the fluters with special attention to some unusual, rare, interesting examples. We will start with the first mass-produced fluter irons that came out in a big way, those being from England in probably the early 1860s. These irons were for the latest style of Victorian fashion, which had ruffled strips of fabric that could be buttoned into the blouses and the edges of clothing. The only people doing this in England were the very rich, the la-di-da women of the great estates, or actually the maids of those great estates. And what they used were quite often very large fluter machines. I have 2 of these English machine fluters here. Both are of small size. Size does matter to those of us who are of limited space. And these machine fluters, the English variety, have rollers on one side, handles on the other. The rollers are very typically of very fine flutes. These are often called crimpers, therefore a very fancy kind of clothing that was more popular in England than here. The pressure on the fabric could be adjusted by knobs. There's 2 on this one, there's 1 on this one, and the one I have here to my left, to your right, is of a very common type found in England. They came in various sizes, some as high as this, and this one reads the Thomas Clark warranted crimping machine. First thing interesting to me is they actually had warranties on these things back then. So this had a warranty and probably was sold in a very fancy clothing store in London, fancy enough to be selling all the clothing for which this thing would be used to iron. The Americans had a very different tack on the fluting machines and the fluting irons in general. It was embraced not just by the great estates of the United States, there were such here, but also by the middle class. This is an example of the first generation of American fluting irons, patented in 1866, perhaps the earliest American patented product that was actually manufactured. The patentee was Henrietta Cole. Henrietta is, to my knowledge, one of the more important female 19th century iron patentees. I have done videos on the other 2 female patent holders, Florence Potts and Susan R. Knox, and would like to do a video on this lady at some later time, but right now I don't know much about her personal history. There were a number of Cole designed fluters in the late 1860s. They are all rare. I am lucky to have 3 representatives of this, and this is my favorite. This particular iron has all the original paint and may well be the last surviving member of its type. The Henrietta Cole fluters had larger flutes, larger than the crimping, smaller, finer flutes popular in England, and it may well be that Henrietta Cole and her fluters set the standard for American popularity in these. The Cole fluter patent had a different idea for how to maintain the pressure on the fabric, and that was an adjustable, let me get this loosened here, an adjustable weight. And that is typical for all of the Cole fluters. Susan Knox's patent came out in 1866, a few months after Henrietta Cole's. The Cole patent, I think, developed into a number of irons in the late 1860s. Susan Knox, she licensed her patents to many companies, and these companies produced her patented fluting irons, oftentimes with her name on it, over the period from the early 1870s going at least into the 1880s and maybe later. The patent itself, Susan Knox patent, had a spring in the center rather than the weight, and it had a device in the back to help control, to lift this apart so you can put the fabric in. And this is rather unique to her patent. Most of the other irons did not have that thing in the back. And that's one of the ways you can oftentimes see Susan Knox irons. This is the original Knox, so this is one of the early patents coming out initially about 1870, and this one's interesting. This one's electric. Even has a little, it's wired into the bottom and has a little switch here that can turn on the electricity. Essentially, it is an old original Knox. I think there was a bunch of these left over, no longer selling very well, and I think that North Brothers, which was the company that was making these at that time, decided to sell some as electric irons. They have some minor differences with the others. The rollers and the handle here are chromed, and of course you also have the cord, the plug here being not original. So you might think that this is merely somebody's later modification, but I've seen two of these, and the two of these very substantially the same as this one. So apparently Susan Knox's irons were still being sold with this electric modification into the, I'm thinking, late 1890s, maybe early in the 1900s. So that's three machine fluters that we've not seen previously, presented to give you a bit of the broad history of that group. Let's talk about the hand fluters. These smaller hand fluters are almost unique to the United States. They were picked up by the middle class, these up-and-coming ladies who imagined themselves being like the great Victorian ladies in the great estates, and so they wanted some of the same kind of fabric in their clothing, and oftentimes willing to do it themselves. They didn't have much in the way of maids, and so they bought these small things. These, again, almost unique to the United States, but there is an exception. This is the Albert, spelled Albert, hand fluter from France, and they're quite rare, have a fair amount of value to them, usually found with just the hand fluter portion, but this one actually also has the base, again marked Albert there. It's all cast metal, one piece, and this is what they use for fluting. There was another fluting iron tradition in Europe. These are Dutch. These are made of wood. There are earlier examples of this, handmade examples going back to the early 1800s, maybe even late 1700s. But these are plainly machine made. They're crimpers. They have the fine flutes here. Being as they are machine made, these would be from the late 1800s, and as good a condition as these are, and I've seen a fair number of these over the course of time, I think these are probably actually used into the early 1900s as well. We will look at a very few American hand fluters to show some of the interesting ones there. This is the Ogden fluter. The inscription in paint is Ogden, patent applied for. I've not been able to find a patent, and there may never have been one. The slug would be inside here, and I actually have three of these. If anybody wants one, let me know. I only have one base. The base is very rare and something to look out for. The base has a brass bottom plate that is wrapped around a sheet of wood. Again, these are very uncommon. Sometimes these things will turn up on their own, so they're worth trying to recognize, those of you who are pickers. The Ogden fluter. And this is a very interesting iron. It has an interesting history. We have actually seen this before. It was in our first video. It was on the bank of irons behind me. I did point it out. We'll show it in greater detail here. This is a sensible fluter made by Nelson Streeter. We've had a video on him. He always made very well built and quite clever little devices. This is a slug fluter. Here's the slug in this base. Again, marked patent applied for, and again, no patent that I can find. It says the sensible fluter. Apparently the first use of the word sensible by Nelson Streeter, and apparently is one of the first iron products done by Nelson Streeter. Very early 1870s, maybe 1872, 1873, and this predates most of the other hand fluters from the many other companies. But wait, while going through all these, working on this video, this is a unnamed fluter. It's very interesting. It has a short roller, and it has the handle going up to each end, and I call it the diagonal fluter. This has exactly the same base as that one, right down to the patent applied for in the same font at the bottom. And I've seen several of these. This is not just a marriage of one of these on top of one of these. I think these belong together, and if so, then this is a very early Nelson Streeter. I don't think this has been previously recognized as Nelson Streeter. If so, it's one of his very early ones. It's probably the first Nelson Streeter that has a wood handle. Interesting. There were a wide diversity of hand fluters that came along in the late 1870s, and each of these had its own particular handle design or other gimmick. This is patented by Charles Babcock of Buffalo, New York in 1880, and it has, well, Babcock in his claim mentioned the U-shaped shank. Okay, so it's got a U-shaped shank, and then it's got this odd side handle here. This is one very close to the one that is illustrated in the patent. Again, it is a slug iron. It has the Sundry Manufacturing Company, Buffalo, New York, which was the foundry that manufactured irons of Babcock's patent. And as is true for many of these fluting irons, there are, whether you call them a diversity within this group or simply another variety, this is another version, if you will, having a different base, nice little trivet, and then this is one that you'd heat on the stove. It's not a slug, and here this one has an iron handle rather than a wood handle, but another variant of that basic design. There were a number of interesting combination hand fluters that came out in the early 1870s. This is patented in 1870, and I showed this. This is the Hyatt Plutar. I showed this before. It's fairly rare, and you only find the bottom. The only one that I had ever seen anywhere was the bottom. I mentioned at that time a longing for the top plate just to see what it looked like, and now, more recently, one came up at auction and I bought it. I now have the top and bottom. The top is iron, the bottom is zinc, and I do want to make sure that I show this off and describe this a little bit because it's something for you to keep an eye out for. And again, this top here may well be disassociated with the bottom, and this has some value all by itself. It has a wooden handle, black color. It has a brass band around here. Again, this is iron. The bottom here is zinc. This is the Hyatt Plutar, complete. And now I'm going to show off two very rare, quite interesting combination irons. This is a rotating iron. Rotating irons had a long history, 1850s into the early 1900s. The idea was that there is a heater inside. This is fueled by a liquid fuel. I would think of filtered oil, probably not gasoline. Patented 1884, and gasoline wasn't getting to be very available until after that. Patented by John Yarger Again, 1884, all chromed, very fancy, fluting irons on both sides, plus you have 2 flat iron surfaces that you can rotate through. This is, I think, one of the most attractive and one of the more sought after of all the old American sat irons. Final iron in this video, perhaps the penultimate iron amongst many interesting irons today. This is the Myers Goat Fluter, patented by Frederick Myers, 1872. Frederick Myers always had an eye for something stylish and unusual. This one has a goat motif in the front. The patent, what's being patented here is this little latch here that I can, and this opens here so I can put my fabric in very easily, close it down. I can now, turning the handle here, I can flute with it, but it is a combination fluter. It also serves as a flat iron. Now, I can't imagine anybody fluting and using a flat iron. Another flat iron would be much easier than having to go through all those measures. It is a rarity. It has some serious value. It's marked as the fashion iron on the top. Hard to believe, this is our 68th video, and I still have many more subjects and topics that I'm looking to explore, meet people that have better collections on various categories than I have. So we are still busy with these things. I have very much enjoyed the correspondence I've had with a lot of the people, you people who are watching these, and I look forward to continuing these dialogues in the future. Thank you very much.